our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun with something we think is particularly timely and particularly interesting, and it's just going to be fun for we energy lovers. We're excited to welcome Chris Birdsall today. Chris, his title is he's Director of Economics and Energy at Exxon Mobil. He's been at the company for 27 years. He's been in his current role for 5 years. But what the company has done under Chris's leadership, and we'll hear more about his team and everything that goes into this, but they've come out with a 2050 report or 2050 projection, which they view as the most realistic projection for the energy sources we'll be using in 2050, and of course the energy needs we'll have in 2050. Chris, we're delighted to have you join us. We really appreciate it and can't wait to walk through some of the key takeaways.
Thanks for having me here. It's just really great to be here.
Well, it's really going to be fun. Mike, the market is never a dull moment, as we used to have an old friend say. Also, we're into earnings season. What would you tell all of us about what's happening right now?
Yeah, Maynard, I think you hit it on head. There is volatility in the market. And, we've been talking about this for the last weeks and months, is that the market, equity markets are really taking their cue from the bond markets. And as we saw a couple of days ago, that the 10-year bond got above 5%. We're a little bit lower now, around 4.85%. I think what the bond market's trying to get a sense for now is like, how are we going to pay for these record deficits? This year, we're going to have a $2 trillion deficit. That's up double what people expected. And that's with economic growth. What happens when economic growth slows? What is the deficit going to look like? And I think the bond market is saying, we don't know who's going to buy those bonds. Yields are going to have to remain higher for a while. So that's going to stay with us, especially since we have the House right now with no leader. Nothing's getting through. So that's a big issue for the markets. I'd say from a crude oil standpoint, crude oil today is around $84 a barrel. As you recall, on Friday, it got up to around 89 and a half. It's now down about $5 and a half, $6 since then. And the reason why is going into the weekend, people were concerned that Israel was going to launch their offensive in Gaza. And it looks like that's being delayed, at least near term. The market's reacting to that. I think the other thing market's reacting to is where bond prices are. That's going to slow the economy. And so that's that. I'd say from the standpoint of, equity markets, some of the things that we're looking at this week is going to be a heavy week of earnings for both natural gas E&Ps, the oil majors, and also for, the oil services firm. Halliburton reported their earnings today, but there's going to be a lot of companies with reports. And I think what you're generally seeing is the same theme is, look, onshore looks, activity levels were down a lot, but pricing is holding. Offshore, international, activity is up and pricing is better. So, we're not going to hear much more different than that. And so that's out there right now. I think, and the last thing I'd say is, and Arjun's maybe going to talk a little bit about this, but, obviously mergers, you've had two big mergers, Chevron looking to buy Hess and Exxon looking to buy Pioneer. And I think the thing that stands out to me is the market caps of both of these companies once these deals go through. Exxon's around $500 billion, and Chevron will be around $350 billion. The next closest competitor would be Shell at $220 billion. So if you look at what's going on in markets right now, the major oil companies in the U.S. are about a 2 multiple point premium to the international majors now. We don't know what's going to happen, but that is a big, big gap. And so I think there's going to be some action at some point there. So that's what's going on right now. Maynard, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Yep. Certainly, Arjun, energy entertains us with constant activity. What would you add in before we jump in with Chris?
Maynard, I thought I'd build upon some of the M&A comments that Mike was alluding to. There's obviously been a number of large transactions, but there's been a series of smaller transactions as well. I'm not here to sit here and give specific comments on whether we like these deals or not, but I just wanted to provide some big picture takeaways on some of the M&A trends and what I think it means. I think the first point people ask is, when any company, whether it's the largest ones that Mike alluded to or any of the mid-sized ones are doing M&A, does it mean they're inherently bullish on oil and gas demand? And I think it certainly means they're probably not bearish. But when I think you look at the type of the resource that's been bought, whether it's Permian acreage, and I think Pioneer Natural Resources was broadly viewed as having generally low-cost Permian resources. Guyana has long been recognized as an especially low-cost oil resource. These are known basins, known quantities of oil, generally at the low end of the cost curve. I do not believe this is a statement that you inherently have to be bullish or bearish on demand. And what I mean by that is in the more draconian net zero scenarios, these low cost resources should be amongst those, quote, last barrels produced. This is the type of oil you'd want to own, kind of irrespective of whether you're bullish or bearish. Clearly, if you have a more optimistic view, then some of the upsides from additional resource exploration, exploitation, improving recovery rates will be helpful. But I do think for the kind of M&A we've seen so far, a lot of it is about individual companies being able to extend their source of competitive advantage. And I don't think it necessitates an inherently bullish demand view for those who don't share what is my own, and I think our own, more optimistic outlook for both oil and natural gas. I think the second point I want to make is this question of should, again, whether it's the largest companies or anyone below their size, should they have done new energies CapEx instead? Could you take 50 or 60 billion or some of the smaller deals that were 10 billion or 5 billion and instead done new energies? And what I'd say is this doesn't obviate anything. In fact, to the extent you have existing strong companies that frankly are going to be incrementally stronger with more free cash flow, if there are things in new energies that are worth doing, they'll be in a better position to do it. But the idea that they had to do it and they had to transition fast, quote unquote, which they faced a lot of pressure to do, especially a couple of years ago, when oil and gas was out of favor, we were near the troughs of the cycle, and kind of the optimism about new energies was particularly high. I give these companies credit, and specifically Exxon Mobil and Chevron, for resisting the extreme pressure they were under to have to transition at that time. We saw different strategies that were taken by some of the largest companies in Europe, and some of them are kind of pulling back on some of that. That's not the point here. These companies resisted the pressure, and look what's happening in new energies. We need the stuff, but they're going through growing pains. We're seeing CapEx increases. We're seeing uncertainty on the scale-up potential. We're seeing what happens when you invest in low-return projects and interest rates rise, and suddenly your margin's gone away, and you're facing CapEx inflation. These companies could have gone down that road. They didn't, and I think they deserve some credit. So if you're an investor looking at whether it's the super majors in the US or anyone below them, I do think there was a discipline there. There was a sticking to what they knew that sometimes we forget to give them credit for, and I want to specifically give both Exxon Mobil and Chevron credit for that. I think the third point I want to make is when you think about big oil planning assumptions, I'm speaking generically, not necessarily about any individual company, they tend to often be based on conservative price decks, or at least what an investor or analyst would consider generally conservative. They're usually based on, can I get after this resource? Can I improve costs? Can I improve recovery rates? That is often the driver, not some bullish outlook for oil and gas pricing. But what I would observe here is that we're in a world where back end of the oil curve has barely moved. Most transactions reflect some notion of strip pricing. We're at a time where while spot is up, back end is barely budged. Yet we know that shale is starting to mature. I think at Veriton, myself, we do think there's still a lot of room that shale will grow, but it may not grow at the million barrel a day type rates it was doing 5 years ago. We're going to need other sources of supply, but we're not going after them anymore. We got CapEx closer to trough for industry than to peak. We have oil demand generally surprising to the upside versus those especially draconian net zero by 2050 expectations. We have the new energies CapEx facing obvious growing pains. And you're even hearing leading electric vehicle makers like Tesla, which has been a smashing success, talk about maybe having a little less robust growth going forward. How can we live in a world where we have massive energy needs, especially for the other 7 billion people, soon to be 9 billion people on Earth, when we're not really investing in the old stuff? We're still closer to trough CapEx. The new stuff is growing through growing pains. So when you look at back end oil, we're not here to forecast oil prices. But what it would say is for any of the M&A activity, not necessarily just the ones recently announced, but any of it, if you're doing it now, you're buying it on a kind of price deck that I would argue has more upside risk than it does downside risk. When will that be realized? I don't know. China faces economic uncertainty. The US faces economic uncertainty, and so does Europe. So it may not be 2023 or 2024. But if you're engaging in M&A activity now, you're buying it on a long-dated oil price that I would say risk reward is to the upside, so long as we remain in this world where CapEx is closer to trough than to peak, and the new energy stuff is also facing transition. And we all know the world needs energy, need all form of energy. it needs the new stuff, it needs the old stuff, and everything in between. And with that, Maynard, I'm very excited to turn the conversation back over to you and to get into it with our guest today.
Yeah, thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Mike. And Chris, thank you. It's great to be with you. We were so excited when we saw the global outlook come out. And I would say, speaking for all of us, the one reason to get excited is there's a lot of fighting going on, so to speak, about where the world is headed from an energy demand and supply standpoint, and what flavors we're going to use to meet that demand. So it's fun to see Exxon enter the discussion with your report. But let me stop talking, welcome you, and ask you to tell us whatever you tell us just to kick off your introduction to the team's report.
Yeah, no, thanks for the brief intro, and I thought Arjun summarized it quite well. For decades, Exxon Mobil has published what we think our most likely view of long-term markets are. Obviously, the energy business, very capital intensive. We have to have a long-term view as we're planning these large capital investments. And 2018, 2019, even shortly after the pandemic, I did kind of feel like we were on an island a bit where, we kept saying, no, we see growth potential. Yes, the world took a step back with the pandemic, but that's temporary. It won't be lasting. And there were lots of organizations that were saying, no, peak oil has happened, peak fossil fuels. And we can see how it's played out so far. So this is a really critical document for us internally. It is the basis for our strategies and plans. So you highlighted the recent announcement of the Exxon Mobil Pioneer merger. That's based on a view that we do see a really long runway for oil demand and some great attributes of the Permian, both in terms of the low cost, as Arjun mentioned, but also relatively low GHG intensity when you look at resources around the world. And so that's an example of we're doing our internal work, we're really trying to study markets, and we're placing big bets behind it. Now, we also take it externally because we want to facilitate a dialogue. I have a team. There's about 20 dedicated resources to this work. And then, of course, we leverage other parts of our corporation. But every one of us will tell you we don't have a crystal ball. We're trying to project forward the most likely view. But if we were great at it, well, we'd all be individual traders sitting on a beach somewhere, finishing up our bets for the day. So we know we don't have a crystal ball. We know there's uncertainty. And that's why we like to engage in a dialogue like this to really get feedback. And I want to hear different views. And as we go through it, I want you to interject and tell me where you see it slightly differently or you see something similar, because that only makes our work that much better. So I want to start out with a concept for what our outlook is versus what it isn't. We've already talked about it. Ours is a projection. It is our most likely view for how we think the world will play out. And my team and I were studying factors like economic development across the world, technology improvement, consumer choices, policy evolution. We're synthesizing all of that into our most likely view. And so on the left side, our outlook, that's our most likely view of global energy-related emissions. The International Energy Agency does something similar with their stated energy policy scenario. So that's their sector by sector assessment of what's the policy that's out there that's being discussed. And so when you look at the two trends, pretty similar over the next 10 to 15 years, and then of course the cone of uncertainty opens up. When we do our modeling, we do think about it over two different time horizons. The first decade, we're looking at where is capital flowing? Where is investment going? What's getting built? What's permitted? Because that's what's going to set the energy system roughly for the next 10 years. Then after that, we get past 1 to 2 political cycles, and that cone of uncertainty can open up. And then we're looking at, we have to take assumptions on how do we think technology will improve or policy will evolve. So again, these two lines here, we call this current trajectory. And there are very few institutions that still try to put forward, a most likely view. You actually, when you do it, you open yourself up to quite a bit of criticism. And I know we're going to be wrong at something. I just don't know exactly what parts will be wrong. But what gets talked about a lot externally, and I think Arjun alluded to this, is some of the different Paris-aligned scenarios, which are sometimes are called normative scenarios or backcasted pathways. So here, the projection is picking an endpoint. It might be a certain carbon budget or a net zero by a certain date, and then it backcasts what are the steps that society needs to take in order to achieve that outcome. And so what I've animated in here is that this big gray wedge, and I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but there's a bunch of thin white lines. Those are over 300 different pathways from the UN's IPCC database. And it's a subset. I know you had Dr. Pielke on a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the thousands of different scenarios that the IPCC looks at. Here, we've pulled a subset, which are called the lower 2C. So it's a pathway for Paris Agreement. And then, of course, we've animated in also the IEA net zero scenario. And look, both of these views are important. I think it is important that society understands what are the steps that society needs to take to achieve Paris. But we also have to be 100% crystal clear on what's the trajectory that society is on. We can't delude ourselves into thinking, well, just because we see it on paper or see it in the spreadsheet, that's the pathway the world will be on. So that's a little bit a difference in approach and kind of the first reason why you see a difference between what we're projecting versus what the IPCC would say or the IEA net zero would say.
So Chris, can I ask you a question around all this? This is a world that, Arjun in particular, very versed in all these scenarios that come out of all these different places, including OPEC, et cetera. But the thing that's sort of striking visually on that between the net zero forecast and the Exxon and the IEA steps forecast is that these things diverge not 10 years out or 20 years out. They diverge like next week.
Yeah.
So we should be able, it's kind of one thing to argue about what's happening in 2045, but you can see on that chart, like things are diverging in 2025. So why in the community of forecasters is there not more discussion about something that is, because you can't change the energy system in a few years?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic point. And one of the things I'll share, and I alluded to this in the intro, that for our first 10 years, we are looking more at, where is capital flowing, because that will set the near term. And so we are looking at, okay, well, how many EVs are being sold? And then further upstream for that, how many EVs are being manufactured? What are the battery plants and the OEM announcements that have come into place? And that, as we all know, it's capital intensive business. It takes time for capital stock to turn over. And I think that's one of the biggest things that just doesn't get discussed enough is that near term.
And can I just ask you on that, because it's also really interesting. I think much was made recently that the stat was something like investment in non-hydrocarbon energy, that CapEx for the first time exceeded the CapEx in oil and gas, if I have that right, or it was some rough sketch like that. But just because capital is going in doesn't mean that energy is coming out. Like how when you guys look at where the capital is flowing, you just mentioned it, how do you then make assumptions around, well, how much energy we will get from that spending?
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well. And obviously not every dollar of capital and not every supply in terms of BTUs or million barrels per day of oil equivalent, that capacity is not the same. And so, we know a combined cycle natural gas turbine plant can run, 65 to 85% of the year, whereas a solar panel, sitting in Texas, it's probably closer to 20%. And so when you hear these capacity numbers, yeah, capacity is important, but then, well, what's the capacity factor, the average factor behind that? And that's ultimately what shapes what the generation or the energy supply will be. It's a really important point.
This community of forecasters, I know that BP used to do the statistical survey. It's now at a separate organization, but you made this comment about when you do macro forecasts, you have to be careful you could get criticized. Are we doing more macro forecasts in today's world than we used to, or about the same? Or how would you comment on just the number of forecasts that are out there and what the attitudes are about these types of forecasts?
Yeah, lots of different pathways, but I would say fewer true forecasts. So more of a scenario approach, which look, I alluded to it. I think scenarios are really important. The world is uncertain, so it's important to kind of understand, well, what are the potential bookends of how the world could evolve? And so a lot of agencies have gone to the scenario approach, and even the IEA, they'll be very explicit saying, look, none of our individual scenarios is they don't put any more weight on one versus the other. They're just trying to give the bookends. The challenge, though, is then how the community, the generalist community, especially investors, receive and understand those, because they can get interpreted as a forecast, as a projection, especially when it's kind of short headlines. So I do see fewer organizations kind of putting themselves out there with what they think their most likely view is. So just two other really important points on this slide. One is I always hear the energy transition talked about as if it's a preordained pathway. And I think what this big gray wedge shows is no, there's not one pathway for the world to achieve Paris. People like to focus on their favorite solutions, but there's a bunch of different ways to get there. And then the other obvious key point is our outlook is our most likely view, and it's not yet on track for Paris. And that's why we said, look, significant change going forward, because we are projecting a 25% reduction in emissions. That would be the first time in modern history that the global economy has grown and emissions have declined. So it's a big change, but we said in our headlines, more is needed. It's because we're not on track for Paris yet. But this is just emissions, obviously, and I think some of this came in some of the intro comments. There is a big human development story that's associated with the energy system, and that is because access to reliable and affordable energy directly correlates with quality of life. And this is a chart. It's based on UN data that we've published for a number of years, but the y-axis is the UN Human Development Index, which is a composite metric that tries to look at things like life expectancy and education levels and alleviating poverty, a metric that really tries to look at quality of life. And then on the x-axis is how much energy per person on average is consumed in any given country, and then the size of the bubbles represents the population of those countries. So in this chart here, 3 billion people that have living standards, frankly, we take for granted living in high-income places like the United States or countries in the European Union. I mean, basic needs like we don't question access to safe drinking water or clean cooking fuels. It's just it comes out of the spigot. But there is some good news here, and that is that this data is not static, and there are amazing human development stories. And so I've animated in the rest of the world, and China is one example that has made incredible progress over the last 2 decades, and China is actually now in the high human development category. And over that same time, those last 2 decades, energy consumption per person in China nearly tripled. So nearly tripled, fueling one of the largest economic expansions the world has ever seen. And so the key point here is people all around the world are seeking a better life, and we know that higher living standards come with higher energy consumption. And I find this gets lost in the public discussion on emissions and climate change. Now, look, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we should drive human development and just ignore emissions. The point that I want to make is we actually need both. We need to improve human development as well as address emissions at the same time. So just some of our quick assumptions, what ultimately underpins a future projection of energy and product needs. We start with population, and Arjun, you hit this very well. As we look forward from today, 2 billion more people on the planet, and nearly all of that in the developing world, the non-OECD. And then just one fun fact I love is if you look at the population growth today, not sometime in the future, the world is averaging over 1 million people to the planet every single week, just to put that kind of 2 billion new people in the world out in 2050. Over the same time frame, we project that the global economy will double, and GDP is expected to grow twice as fast in the developing world as in the high-income OECD. And when you put these two together, it contributes to a significant rise in living standards, with GDP per capita, kind of a proxy for purchasing power per person, is expected to nearly double over time. So, this is the human development story. It's amazing progress. This is great to see. This is what drives the overall increase in energy demand, but it also contributes to the emissions challenge as well. And so this is two simple bar charts that just describes the state of the emissions challenge today. And this comes from the IPCC sixth assessment report, looking at society's emissions by source on the left and the greenhouse gas emission on the right. And the point I try to remind people is that every part of our economy, every part of our daily lives has embodied emissions associated with it. And I know people usually think about emissions from our cars and from heating our buildings, but actually things like agriculture and land use, the very bar at the top, is a bigger contribution to emissions. If the industrial sector at the bottom, which is, that's the manufacturing of the basic goods and infrastructure that we rely on every day, is actually the largest sector for emissions. And then, of course, you see on the bar chart to the right that our emissions are not just merely energy-related CO2, which of course, it is a big part, and we talk about quite a bit, but virtually all aspects of modern life are contributing to climate change. And so I always like to start with kind of these two key messages, human development, society's need to improve quality of life, and then at the same time, addressing emissions. And so this is something that we've tried to introduce the moniker of the "and" equation, because I find, like, I'll go to a meeting in the developing world and it's all about human development and we don't talk about emissions. And then I take a trip into a high-income country, or I go visit, in Brussels or Washington, D.C., and it's all about emissions and it's not about human development. And the point we're trying to make is it requires both. And this is a big part of Exxon Mobil's strategy, because actually to solve any side of this is incredibly challenging. Now put these two together and it probably is the greatest challenge that we face as a society, because, as we know, today's lower emission solutions, they are more expensive. And so it creates this tension point between society's goal for reliable and affordable energy on the one hand, but then at the same time, our goal for lower emissions. And so I just find this is the complexity and the nuance that gets lost in the discussion.
Chris, I might just interject here, because I think this is a really powerful and important point you're making. And certainly what you articulated, that we need to deal with human development. People are going to want to have improving standards, but we have to deal with emissions and of course, other environmental challenges. We agree with that at Veridan. I personally agree with that. Where I come out on this, though, is if there is a choice, the developing world is going to pick the left side. Yeah. And when I think about the quantity of the people, and when I think about the fact that maybe 50, 100 years ago, what the US said, what Europe said, would have had a huge impact on the decisions they were able to make. That's no longer the case. China's got its own financial system. They got their own economic strength. They're going to do whatever they want to do. I think India's in that bucket of being able to do whatever they want to do. Maybe some of the African countries, unfortunately, might still face impact from what European banks decide or don't decide. But I do wonder, if I'm being pragmatic, because I really liked your approach, that we're trying to put out there a most likely forecast. And you can always have scenarios, but a most likely forecast. I believe unless the new technologies actually do scale at cost without massive government subsidy, the left side is going to overwhelmingly win. That's my opinion. I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, and I think this is the tension point that exists between trying to balance these things. And I think just kind of further proof point to your hypothesis, even look at what the high income countries had to do when suddenly Russian gas supply was cut off to Europe, and amazing ability to adapt and respond to that. But at the end of the day, it resulted in more coal use because people had to keep warm. The lights had to stay on. And so to me, that was just a telling data point that says when the Venn diagram doesn't line up for these two things, I do think people will tilt towards, hang on, I have to stay warm today.
Can I just, we were in a meeting yesterday, Chris, and it's been a while since we've talked about this, but I'd say, if you go back a couple of years ago when we were really going to kind of, when a big push began around all this, not that we haven't been doing it for decades, but part of the discussion was energy is going to be cheaper as we switch from old to new. So we're going to get the right side, and we're going to be able to do the left side at lower cost. And and I'm not saying that's what you and your team ever believed, Chris, but I think that that's still something that a community of people is holding on to. But the more we've gotten into this and the more we've looked at all these changes and the reality of some of the new investments, it's become clear that that would not be anyone's forecast, I think, for lower energy costs. Is that a fair way to frame kind of how the other side?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, what I always try to tell people is designing the optimum energy system. So one that is reliable, it's the lowest possible cost, and it's reducing emissions and other environmental impacts. That's a complicated puzzle with a lot of pieces. And if you try to overbuild or underbuild any one of those important pieces, you will end up with a system that is not as optimized. And so, the easiest example is solar, especially rooftop solar in the middle of summer in Texas. That makes a lot of sense, right? That's when your AC is running the hardest. Okay, great. But if you overbuild beyond that optimum, now you're just adding costs, because now you're adding extra storage costs. You're backing out potentially another lower cost energy source. And so I find that conversation on, well, new solutions will be cheaper. Well, they're real anecdotes, but when taken too far, you are adding cost to the system. Maybe just take kind of a macro view to provide some perspective before we maybe dive into a couple of the sectors. And so in our outlook, energy demand grows about 15%. to 660 quadrillion BTUs. And if you're more used to million barrels per day, that's around 325 million barrels per day of oil equivalent. And I usually start with this page because it is just hard to grasp just how big the global energy system is. So let me give one kind of fun fact. As big as Exxon Mobil is, and we even talked about now a Pioneer will be slightly bigger, as big as Exxon Mobil is, we are 1% of the global energy system. And with Pioneer together, we'll be like 1.5%. And it's just the scale of the energy system is hard to grasp. And then the regional differences. What you see on the right that, again, a lot gets discussed, a lot happens in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, but it's less than 15% of the global population and a smaller part of the energy system. And as we go through the different slides, the real growth is in the developing world. One other regional difference I like to talk about is you look in the sector, the largest sector today in terms of fuel inputs is in power generation. And we look at that wedge and we think about nuclear and renewables and all that's great, but actually almost half of that wedge today is coal. And that is a reflection of the regional disparities, because while coal has been rapidly declining in the high-income OECD, it's still the lowest cost supply of power generation in places like China, India, and other countries in the non-OECD on the right. And so that's why when we think about the global energy system, we really do have to look at it on region by region, because that optimum mix and the solutions that are available at the right price, it differs vary depending on where you are in the countries or in the world, sorry. So this is just the overall macro view. Let's dive into a couple of the sectors. So transportation, it is much more than just passenger cars. I find that when I go talk externally, what people want to ask me about are passenger cars, electric vehicles, and that's great. But it's actually global commerce. Moving goods around the world via trucks, ships, and planes is a much bigger growth driver for the sector, which is why I love this picture that our public affairs team pulled out, because it perfectly illustrates what's really driving transportation fuel demand. So for us, the passenger vehicle, light duty car, the light green at the very bottom, in our outlook, we see vehicle ownership growing as the middle class grows globally, but higher efficiency of traditional internal combustion engines, as well as penetration of electric vehicles, leads to a peak in demand sometime this decade, followed by a decline. In our modeling work, we do it country by country. Globally, we have EVs getting up to just over 55% of sales by 2050, and I would say that's one of the more conservative views. I will say for fuel importing countries like countries in the European Union or China, we do have much higher penetration. We're going up to around 75 to 80%. But again, that's not the total world. That's not the total car park. And it takes time for the fleet to turn over. So that's why liquid fuels are still a big part of road transportation. But as I highlighted the intro, the big growth story is in the commercial transportation and in the developing world. When we do our modeling, first we start with what's an activity basis? How many tons of freight need to be moved around the world from ports to final destination? And that correlates with economic growth. So that ultimately sets the activity. And then we overlay things like continuing efficiency improvements, whether that's the engine or the aerodynamics or how supply chains are optimized. And that tempers the growth going forward, such that I know I don't have the breakout here, but again, in the high income countries, we actually do project transportation to be flat to slightly down. So a majority of this growth is in the developing world.
Chris, can I just ask you, because we all talk about those, percentage of new car sales, and you mentioned 55% would be EVs by 2050. At your projections, when do we have more EVs globally than we have ICE vehicles?
Oh, in terms of the car park, that's a great question. I don't have it directly in front of me. What I remember is
past 2050, I guess.
Yeah, because the one fun fact I always remember is until EVs get to about 30% sales, the ICE fleet is still growing because they're still 70%, and that's more than offsetting the retirement. So yes, it's a long ways out because of the fleet turnover. Now this is one of the important signposts that we watch, though. Like what are actual EV sales, and how does that compare to the ramp up we have in our projection?
And when you look at EV sales, are you thinking, have you gone in and projected like critical minerals necessary and critical minerals pricing and just scale of all that? Like, how do you?
Yeah,
there's so much that goes into that projection.
Absolutely. And so between now and 2030, first we're looking at kind of the firm FIDs that the auto manufacturers and the battery plants are putting in. And then when we take a step back and translate to critical minerals, it's almost like a classic story of oil and gas as well. There's plenty of resource for critical minerals. It's will the world permit and FID the new mines that are needed? And so, one of the reasons our view is a little bit more conservative than others is that, first we're watching near-term sales. What are OEMs investing in? We think that's going to be more of the limit this decade. But then, in order for this to scale, many more mines have to come on.
But we still got the whole other wedge here. That's such a great picture that, heavy trucking, I think we can have a lot of debate on how much of that will be electrified. Yeah. I'm not sure electric ships, we had a captain on a month or two ago, is something we should be anticipating, right? So it's just such a small piece we're talking about, and it gets all the mind share. Tesla's been a massive success, but it's just such a small sliver of this mix.
Yeah, well said, Arjun. So industrial sector, I mentioned this at the very beginning. It's a really critical sector, but this is another one that externally I don't think gets talked about enough, because this is what supports the basic products that society uses every day. I mean, everything around us. And this chart here is just historical data, but the growth rates in things like plastic, cement, aluminum, and steel has been tremendous because they're all part of modern living. And then notice the blue line, which is the energy inputs into this sector, and then the red line, which is the emissions intensity. So the CO2 per BTU, it shows that because of efficiency gains, while these products, in the case of plastics, have grown 5x over this time period, the energy demand growth has been much lower. Again, big efficiency technology story. And then when it comes to the emissions intensity, in the last decade, it started rising as China's coal-based manufacturing really came to the global markets. But over the last 10 years, that red line, it's kind of hard to see with the scale, but it's declined about 10%. That's, if you think about the long-term capital that gets deployed in big industrial manufacturing, that's pretty impressive for the world to be able to reduce the emissions intensity just around 10%. That's the positive story. The real challenge moving forward is that there will be parts of the sector that are incredibly challenging to decarbonize. You'll put aside the energy products that Exxon Mobil sells, the upstream part of our business and the fuels. We're actually a large industrial manufacturing company. In fact, my career, I started in our chemicals manufacturing, and these are large manufacturing processes that require intense heat, and they're very energy intensive. And so finding solutions to be able to decarbonize those, that's where things like carbon capture and hydrogen, while more expensive than just running straight coal or natural gas, will be critical solutions to helping to decarbonize. The key point that I want to leave you with is don't underestimate the industrial sector. It is the largest sector, and there are some real challenges here. And then maybe just one more slide for industrial. It's also a key driver for oil and gas demand growth because, as you all know, the industry uses oil as a feedstock for chemicals and asphalts and lubricants. And this, in our outlook, is actually the biggest growth driver for oil demand moving forward. A similar story for natural gas. It's critical for the intense process heat that's needed. It's a lower emission option when compared to coal. It's also a critical feedstock for fertilizer, which is important for feeding the growing population. And then just the last point on the electrification. So over the time period, electrification has actually doubled. It has actually gained share as an energy source into industrial manufacturing. And we project it will gain share again out to 2050, again, as manufacturers look for ways to lower their emissions. So that's the industrial sector. Any comments, observations?
Chris, I probably have one big picture observation, which is very simplistically, you had GDP doubling and primary energy demand up 15%. And I would have simplistically said, and maybe I'm just too much of an oil analyst, that it should be at 50% for a 100% increase in GDP. And perhaps its electrification is more efficient from a primary energy use standpoint, but it does feed into both your transportation outlook and this industrial outlook. It seems like that's very little primary energy demand growth. And I am going to give you credit. You're the only one actually forecasting it, Exxon Mobil, and maybe OPEC is. Everyone else somehow has GDP doubling and primary energy demand flat or falling and all these things. But still seems like it should be up a lot more. What am I missing there? It's probably in most of these sectors.
It is the efficiency story. And like you said, so electric vehicles, for example, more efficient use of energy. In power generation, a combined cycle natural gas is much more efficient than coal. Nuclear and renewables more efficient than combined cycle. And then just the overall efficiency improvement. So actually when we look back, what are some of the things that we missed? Actually we had projected continued fuel economy improvements in traditional ICE engines, and it's been slower than we had expected. So that's one of the potential risks to our projection that could create upside. If those big efficiency improvements, technology gains don't come to fruition, we could see even higher oil demand than what we're seeing here.
Chris, when you think about that projection, so over the next not quite 30 years, we'll have the growth you described and we'll have the energy use that Arjun described. When you project that, is that just based on, over that period of time, we've never had 30 years without some economic growth, and you're sort of building in a continuation of the efficiency trends that we've seen? Like how much of it is just projecting what seems rational and minimal versus actually engineering that you believe that growth?
And it is a little bit on the economic side. We're trying to use the conditional convergence model or the solo model that as countries become more rich, more prosperous, their growth tends to slow. And so we use that going forward. And then, it is a sector by sector analysis. And I mentioned we've got about 20 dedicated employees working this, but then we reach out and leverage our own technology organization to really look at, okay, so tell me, how efficient could solar panels get? What's the latest technology, the patents that are out there, and can that come to fruition over this time frame? So we are trying to look at what are those technology advances that then make energy efficiency that much better.
Hey, Chris, one of the points in your 2050 takeaways is that the energy transition is going to be basically dictated by policy, by market solutions and by technology. And I guess, what I want to talk about is more the policy, because we talked in the beginning about interest rates, right? I mean, it seemed like 2 or 3 years ago, people thought that, hey, I'm going to install anything I want in energy transition. It's going to be free. It's going to be subsidized, yada, yada, yada. And what we're finding out here is that it's almost like the amount that we're outspending, the deficits we're creating to get us to where we want energy transition is all actually working against us, because it's making it more expensive. You've seen some of these generating companies are pulling back because the PPAs are too low. They're not high enough. It seems to me that's going to be even more expensive. And so it seems, my question to you is, how much does, interest rate policy and stuff like that kind of go into your models over the next 10 years? And is that something that could make a big difference in getting to sort of 2030 levels, much less 2050 levels?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll tell you, like, as we, were doing our work about 5 years ago, we were always surprised at when you tried to calculate the implied cost of capital in some of these PPA deals, and you could eventually get there with really high amounts of very cheap debt. So that's obviously changing going forward. What I can't answer, and I don't know how, like, the U.S. fiscal debt problem resolves itself. It's actually scary for me to think about. Hopefully it's in a slow, controlled, fiscal discipline, deleveraging way, and then maybe that gets long-term interest rates, back into a band lower than today. But it's crazy what we see in D.C. and I just don't see the current path to get there. I don't know what your thoughts are on this topic.
Well, the one thing I would say is I think the government debt is crowding out private debt, and it's crowding out basically individuals. And what you're seeing right now is particularly Tesla this week, and you saw today with GM. They're basically pulling back on their EV growth. And the reason why they're saying is because not investors, but consumers can't afford these products. And so they're lowering prices. And so if you look at Elon Musk, one of his big things is he wants to decarbonize all of the automotive sector. And his point is consumers look at their monthly pay, their monthly, loans for cars, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And so this thing keeps getting pushed and further out the energy transition, because the U.S. government, all these global governments are crowding out private investment. And so I just think that until we get the handle on that, I think we're going to miss every energy transition target we think we're going to hit.
Yeah, I think, I already mentioned our EV outlook is pretty conservative. And I mean, even we're debating now internally, do we need to lower it ourselves, or is the rest of the world, coming down and catching back up to us? That's something we're going to have to keep watching, because you can definitely see a pivot from where we were just a few years ago. Let me just jump to power generation briefly, because I know that's a hot topic as well. And on the left side is, our view of electricity into the different sectors. The one thing I like to point out is, that the green wedge for electricity in the transportation, it doesn't look like much, but it's actually double-digit growth rates here. It's just a reflection that it's coming off such a small base, and the electricity that the world uses today is primarily in buildings and industrial manufacturing. And then the chart on the right shows the growth in our projection by the different sources. And so wind and solar, we do project that to grow the most. That is supported by technology cost reductions, but also the favorable policy environment that we've seen. And our view is it's an important part of the mix. But, I highlighted before that an optimum energy system, that's the same for an optimum power generation grid, is this nice, perfect balance where all the puzzle pieces fit together. And I do worry a bit that because of the incentive structure, we're overbuilding wind and solar relative to what would be needed. I see all these great energy transition models for power generation, and that actually shows a nice roadmap for how the U.S. and other countries can decarbonize their power generation. And then I look at, well, we're not actually building or deploying to that optimum mix, because what that mix says quite a bit is, yes, you need renewables, you need lots of batteries, but batteries will not be sufficient for the long duration storage that's needed for the multiple days in a row when renewables output is lower. And a lot of these models, they have the remaining capacity base of thermal generation is still there for backup, and there has to be a business model to be able to pay for that. But that's not what countries are actually doing. We're building out the renewables, but we're shutting down the thermal generation. And so I do worry that that's something that eventually will constrain renewables growth, and that's why we're a bit more pessimistic or a bit more conservative on renewables, even though we show it as the largest growth item. And then the other one I want to highlight here is just for coal. You can see we're showing decline here. We have a pretty aggressive phase out for coal into power generation for the OECD. That's the darker bar. The key uncertainty is the developing world, because we're also showing some coal coming out of non-OECD. And that's actually a big change because, remember, electrification in the non-OECD is growing quite a bit. We project coal-fired generation share will drop, but I mean, it's currently going the other way as we look out the window, given some of the high prices and what was more affordable LNG a couple of years ago. Supply chain trying to get renewables pieces into the countries. This is, I would say, one of the risks in our outlook is that coal actually could be higher than what we're projecting here.
Chris, one of my concerns has been that I think oil and gas companies in general and analysts like myself, we tend to overemphasize natural gas and LNG, which is certainly relevant if you're talking about U.S. shale gas to U.S. power gen. But I think if you're India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, we can see them already sort of choking on the high equivalent pricing for that vis-a-vis domestic coal. So I'm not a coal analyst, but I've personally I agree with your OECD forecast, but I kind of think coal is certainly on track to grow for this decade. And I think we'll be fortunate, or from an emission standpoint, if any of it ever gets phased out in the non-OECD, I suspect it's on track to grow. And I do worry sometimes as an oil and gas analyst, am I overemphasizing LNG growth as a coal displacement? And I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So of that gas bar, the non-OECD, about 40% of that is domestic production in the Middle East and Africa. So using their resource, especially in the Middle East, right? Take oil out of power generation, then like Saudi can export that oil. But then, the other part of that growth is LNG. So our view is markets will continue to be tight until this next wave of LNG plants come online. That's Qatar and the U.S. Gulf Coast, which should bring international gas prices back down to the long-term marginal cost that we saw, prior to some of these crises. And that's what we're basing kind of our long-term economics on. It is still more expensive than coal. There's no question. What drives that? Some things like the blue sky policies, trying to reduce smog. But I agree with you. It is for a country like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it is a more expensive import layer for their energy needs. So I know we're getting close to our time. I just want to come back to this chart briefly to really use this to come back and talk about what are some of the solutions that are needed to close this gap from the current trajectory to the Paris pathways. And so what I've animated in here is the growth of solutions from that gray wedge. So this is all IPCC work, lower 2C pathways. And the gray bar represents the average across those pathways. And so I call this the consensus across the models because it is the average. It's not biased by anyone's favorite solution. But then I show the thin line, which is the error bar, showing the 10th percentile, kind of the lowest deployment, all the way up to the 90th percentile. So to my point before, the energy transition is not one single pathway. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So the first insight that pops out was surprise to me as well. The first time I saw it is that carbon capture is probably one of the most important solutions in a 2 degree C pathway. It's the largest solution deployed. And then look at that growth rate, 30% compounded annual growth rate over 30 years. It's honestly hard to fathom that. Beneath that, then you have the low carbon electricity sources, so solar, wind, nuclear. And actually, you can see on nuclear, there are a couple pathways that actually show nuclear declining. So they're relying more on renewables than nuclear. But literally, and I guess we could spend hours just on this chart. But maybe just kind of two observations. One is the scale of deployment is massive. If you think about some of these compounded growth rates, the global energy system has been growing slightly under 2% per year, kind of pre-pandemic. And here we're talking growth rates that are 5 to 10 times that. Even nuclear at 2% per year growth, that's 4 times what its growth has been in the prior decade. So again, just the scale of deployment. And then second, that addressing climate change requires a mix of solutions. There is no pathway that relies on only renewables or only hydrogen. And so, I ignore the pundits that try to exclude a certain solution. And yes, there's challenges in every one of these. Technology has to improve. We need more regulatory transparency. We need, like to your point before, market-driven solutions so that consumers are incentivizing this growth, because governments on their own cannot afford to subsidize at the scale that's needed. So, again, this chart gives you a sense of the solutions that are called upon. Then with this, we can look at it and see, well, is the world on track or not? Is the world deploying this level of low carbon solutions or not? And this is, one of the key charts that I wanted to get to, where in this table, each row is one of the key solutions that gets deployed in the energy transition pathway. And so I grayed out the bottom of the table just to let's focus on the top row just to illustrate how we think about this table. So energy efficiency, we've already talked about this already a bit, that, in our outlook, gosh, we have a lot of energy efficiency. And one of the ways to measure that across different pathways, let's just look at energy consumption per person in the world and how has that changed. And so the first column is, well, how is that changing over the last 5 years? And I ended it at 2019 just to exclude the 2020 pandemic year. And in the world, energy per person was growing 0.3% every single year. And that's a developing world story, right? Because actually in the high income world, energy per person has been declining, but globally up 0.3% per year. And then the rest of the columns are different projections just for this decade. So we were talking before, that there's time when we get out to 2040 for supply chains to adjust and policy to adjust and new technology. But looking at just this decade, our outlook is 0.4%. It's a reversal of the growth. And every time I look at that, I get a bit nervous. But, we've tried to do the bottom up sector by sector. The IEA steps was a little bit less than that. The IPCC lower 2C, that was that big gray wedge, a little bit more. And then the IEA net zero, which requires energy per person to go down 1.7% every year this decade. And so, Maynard, to your point before, some of these pathways show, well, the changes had to start happening yesterday, basically, and they're not happening. So I can look at the IEA's net zero scenario and feel pretty confident that overall energy demand is going to be higher in 2030 than what's in that scenario. And so then the rest of the table, it's just different deployments of solutions. And we use this internally as well as communicating externally. So let me just hit solar briefly. Again, last 5 years, this is utility scale. So put rooftop solar aside for a second. Utility scale, deploying about 80 gigawatts every year. Our outlook is about 115 gigawatts per year. And what I can tell you is, as we look at this, China surprised us. The second half of last year, China suddenly deployed more solar than their prior annual record, which had been in 2017. So I do think we're probably underestimating solar growth here. But having said that, it's still short of what the world would need for a 2 degree C or a net zero pathway. And that same story plays out in all these different low carbon solutions. And that's why we say, look, amazing progress, but more is needed for the world to achieve Paris.
So we are going to lose you here in a few minutes, which is terrible, Chris. We feel like crying because we love this stuff.
I understand.
If you could jump ahead, you have a chart on I think it's your last chart, which is on this one. Yes. Yeah. So this is a really interesting one because if you're right and we roughly need the oil we think we need, people forget we have to find more because we're using what we have each year. So do you want to just talk about the potential application of that wedge? Thank you.
Yeah, because this is something that I see generalist investors just don't appreciate. I mean, your viewers that are in the upstream, they live this every day, they'll get it. And it's the point that, oil and natural gas supply has an annual decline rate. Once you drill that well, you get it max production in the first few years, and then it starts declining every single year. And so on this chart, the lines represent the different demand profiles we've talked about throughout the package, our outlook for oil demand, all the way down to the IEA's net zero scenario. And then the green wedge represents a hypothetical supply case if the world suddenly said, okay, we're done investing in oil, no new developments, no existing infield drilling, the world's oil supply would decline on average, about 7% per year. That is a pretty broad average. It's different across the different pathways. And so this is the point of, even in a flat oil demand world or even a declining demand world, significant oil and gas investment is still needed. And again, I just find this gets lost on the generalist investor on, why is Exxon Mobil, we're serious about climate change. We've announced $17 billion of low carbon investment over the next 5 years. And yet most of our capital is still going into upstream oil and gas. And we just announced the merger with Pioneer. It's because of this that significant investment is still required.
Chris, we always ask at the end, what does the world look like in 10 years? You've told us. You don't have to, you have that view. I think as we wrap up, you projected on that one-page carbon capture was going to grow tremendously. And I guess my question is, to make that projection, are you basing that on the world needs oil and gas and therefore we will have carbon capture? Or are you basing it on the technology looks promising and therefore we will have more of it? Or am I?
Yeah, a little bit both. So in the first decade, the first thing we're looking at is the announced project portfolio. And look, the US IRA has definitely encouraged a bunch of new projects. And so, like Exxon Mobil signed a deal with a fertilizer producer, with a steel producer, because those companies are looking to reduce their emissions. And look, they hope to be able to sell a lower emission product to their consumers. So over kind of the first 10 years, that's what's driving that growth. And look, we'll have to watch the FIDs till they continue to come to fruition. After that, then we are looking at marginal abatement costs. So if the world is serious about reducing emissions in both power generation and the industrial manufacturing sector, carbon capture is one of the more economic solutions. It's a part of a broad set of solutions, but that's going to be much cheaper than trying to electrify certain parts of really high intense process heat. That's where carbon capture and hydrogen, while it's more expensive than current energy on a lower emissions basis, it's one of the more affordable options.
Chris, and maybe look at a next year question. If you put this out next year, where do you think maybe you meet, exceed, or fall short of some of the goals here? What are the areas most ripe to miss on the upside or downside?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll flip this chart up because it puts in perspective the really long term and some of the things we're watching. That the oil demand rebound, we've been a bit surprised at how quickly oil came back. And again, we were one of the more bullish. So that's one I'll keep watching. And then the discussion we had earlier about coal. If you look at coal had peaked around 2014, and it was on a slight decline, but look what happened right after the energy crisis. Both Europe and Asia went back to using coal again, and it popped back up. So that's one that we're watching very closely.
Chris, I've really enjoyed and loved this discussion. I especially like the chart where you had efficiency, solar, wind, and all those other technologies. And I think one of my observations about all the different scenarios and forecasts, not just Exxon's, but others, is there's on the one hand, meeting the world's energy needs, which I think you overwhelmingly have done. Exxon Mobil has done the best job of articulating that as a grounding point, where so many others are purely just the various net zero scenarios. But a couple observations, I think 2 degrees or 1.5, there is sort of a question of if the world is on track actually for 2.4 by 2100, what does it do to kind of the inherent demand for some of these other technologies and the time scale with which they need to ramp? But I think the other point that's often missing in these frameworks is that the coolest thing about solar, wind, and nuclear, and maybe hydrogen, if you're India, if you're China, is that once they're up, they're domestic resources. And so they may not be the lowest cost. They clearly have intermittency issues. But if you don't want to be dependent on Russia or Saudi or Iraq or Iran or Qatar, or I might say US or Canada, you might try to do more of this stuff then maybe the pure economics work. And that's sort of a framing that kind of doesn't put the emphasis on 2 degrees or some degrees numbers. It keeps the emphasis on meeting their energy needs, but recognizing that domestic security is going to be a huge part of meeting those energy needs, and they probably can't just do it with coal. And I'm just curious if you have any observations on that point. We spend so much time in rich countries on sort of energy needs versus 2 degrees, and we're missing the fact that there's a huge domestic resource component to the newer technologies that if you put yourself in the shoes of those countries, they might find appealing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great observation. And, sitting here in the United States, I mean, we really are blessed with an all of the above on resources, right? We've got great oil and gas, coal, we've got nuclear, we've got great renewables resource, and it's not the case all around the world. Maybe one example in our coal outlook. So for China, we have shown coal going down because there is an import layer that China's importing. And so we felt like, well, China can reduce their coal consumption and still sustain domestic manufacturing jobs. But that's one example of a country trying to prioritize energy security and balancing that with affordability as well as their emission goals. But I agree with you that there will be almost like a premium or a demium in the economics on domestic ability to produce, and whether that's wind, solar, nuclear, or domestic coal. I think that's one of the things we're starting to see pivot a bit, especially with the geopolitical tensions rising around the world.
Well, Chris, this is awesome. As I say, we really love going through all this and debating all these things. I guess in the lead-in, I meant to mention, Exxon's got 60,000 employees. You're all around the world. You've got all kinds of experts in the company. Do you get a lot of internal feedback and debate and questions and town halls and no, I think that's wrong, or yes, I think that's right? Like, what is it like at Exxon when you're sharing all this and a lot of smart people are questioning your views?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're so one quick joke. First, we're always wrong, and the reason why we sit in the corporate function and not one of the business lines, because if I listen to each business line, then the world's energy supply would be probably 3 times what it is today. Because of course, each business line is bullish on what it is they do. But having said that, we did make a pivot a couple of years ago to try to engage more with our businesses, our value chains, because when we did a look back on, what are the things that we projected well, what are the things that we missed? So one example was we were always really bullish on chemicals, more so than the other agencies, and yet we underpredicted chemicals. But one of the reasons we believe we were closer is because we have a strong chemical company and we were leveraging their insights. There were other places. I mean, honestly, you can look back at our past projections. We continue to underestimate what would come out of U.S. shale. And yet we have this large XDO business and we weren't leveraging those insights sufficiently. So that's been a big push for us. As you know, we relocated the corporate headquarters from Dallas down to Houston. Part of that is about engaging more with the business lines to make sure we're getting the right market insights into the outlooks and the strategies and plans that we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate it.
I had a lot of fun as well. Thanks, guys. You have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.